Justin smiled at Nora's question. He replied, "They haven't met yet." Nora turned her head hesitantly as Justin explained, "Ever since Cherry came back, Xander has been hiding upstairs. He's got the butler delivering his meals to him in his room. He has been acting strangely every day, and I am not really sure why. But I don't want to bother him too much. I know how difficult this must be for him." And it was difficult for Justin as well. He sensed that, even before he had confirmed Xander's identity, his feelings for the child were quite complicated. On the one hand, he was disgusted by the abrupt appearance of a child that he hadn't known even existed. But, on the other hand, this child might actually be his and Nora's. And, even if the boy was not Nora's, it most likely would be his. Therefore, it was not in him to hate this child. There were even times when he looked into the boy's pure eyes and hoped that Xander could still be saved. Perhaps this child was not as bad as Truman and could be rescued. After all, he was only 5 years old. In such a complicated situation, it was obvious that Xander did not want to interact with Cherry, and Justin was not about to force him. Nora was silent for a moment. "Are you sure they haven't met yet?" Justin was about to answer yes, but he paused to reflect. "At least they hadn't met before I left the house." Nora rubbed her forehead. She knew Cherry too well. She mused, "Well, if I were to hazard a guess, I would say that they have probably met by now." Despite what Justin might think, Cherry was definitely not the obedient type. She would definitely be quite curious to meet the mysterious child if he was living upstairs. Justin immediately became nervous. "That child, Xander, has a bad temper and a foul mouth. Do you think he might try and bully Cherry? I'm going to call and get the butler to take a look." Before he could dial the number, Nora stopped his hand and smiled. "Forget it, Justin. I wouldn't be too sure about who would bully whom." She winked at him, but he shook his head in disbelief. His daughter was too soft and obedient. How could she bully others? It would be impossible. Nora knew exactly what he was thinking and rolled her eyes. It seemed like Justin still did not see the mischievous nature in his little princess. If she were that obedient, why would Nora have Mrs. Lewis keep such a close watch on her? She humored herself with the thought of Cherry matching up with Xander, and wondered who would be the stronger. But Justin wouldn't listen. He pushed the call button on his console. "No, I still have to make the call. Cherry is a girl. She must be protected." Originally, it was not certain who would win between Cherry and Xander, but if there was a father to pull the strings, then Cherry would definitely have the upper hand with Xander. Justin pulled into the drive and made the phone call, while Nora got out of the car to meet with the Stewarts. But when the family members saw the Bentley pull into their circular driveway, everyone in the household became nervous. They wanted to be sure to make a good impression. Jessica took Nora by her hand and led her up the steps. Mrs. Stewart greeted them, then looked beyond to watch the man in his ultra-expensive car chatting on his phone. Mrs. Stewart was very nervous when she saw him. The soft-hearted woman studied Jessica's face and asked carefully, "Why is Mr. Hunt here?" Jessica squeezed Nora's hand for reassurance and then led her mother back inside. "Mom, they just have something that they want to discuss. Do you know where that formula prescription pad is?" Mrs. Stewart nodded. Jessica clapped her hands. "Great. Let's take it out and let Miss Smith and Mr. Hunt have a look at it." Mr. Stewart hurried up the stairs as Justin came into the front hallway. He inquired, "Everything all right?" Nora nodded. "She's just gone off to get the material." Jessica led the three of them into the parlor to wait. Mrs. Stewart came rushing back in with a prescription pad in her hand. Upon seeing Justin, her hands began trembling again. As she handed the formula to Nora respectfully, Nora clasped her hands, trying to steady the older woman. This gave the kind-hearted lady the courage to speak. "Miss Smith, thank you so much for helping Helen. Without your help, Helen definitely wouldn't have been able to get out of that awful marriage. If you want this formula, then please take it. It is the least that we can do. However, you shouldn't take too much of this medicine. Oh my, just look at me." Mrs. Stewart blushed. "You're an alternative medicine doctor yourself, and I'm explaining to you what's the matter with me. I'm sure that after you look at the prescription yourself, you'll completely understand. However, I will tell you from experience that it is best if you only take one pill each time. Obviously, your family has the twin gene. One pill from this formula can help you give birth to triplets. Please don't take too many. Having too many children can be very difficult for the mother." Nora accepted the formula from the generous lady. After opening the tattered, heavily creased paper and seeing the handwritten words on the page, she knew instantly. It was her. The note was obviously written a long time ago. The edges of the paper had been worn down to the point of being frayed, but it had been protected very well by the Stewarts. The piece of paper was extremely old, slightly yellowish, and would most likely rip in half if pulled open too quickly. Nora stared at the fragile relic for a moment before asking, "May I actually have this piece of paper?" Jessica sensed from Nora's expression that this request was quite serious. She nodded. "Sure, I think that would be all right, as we've already copied the formula. We only kept this piece of paper out of respect. I guess you could say to commemorate it." It was apparent that the worn piece of paper had little significance to the Stewart family. Nora nodded. "Thank you. Do you have a folder I can put it in?" As she carefully folded the piece of paper following the creases, Jessica walked over to the desk to grab a manila folder. She handed it to Nora, who thanked her again. Jessica replied, "I should be the one thanking you, but I must ask you not to share the information on that paper. Please keep this secret between us." Nora understood, so she nodded. If everyone came looking for this secret medicine, it would only mean trouble for all parties concerned. She headed toward the door, indicating to Justin that she was ready to leave. Justin started to go, but then turned back to speak with Jessica. He stuck out his hand and said, "If there's anything you need in the future, you can count on this promise." After all, although Nora had helped the Stewarts, it was obviously difficult for Jessica to share the formula to repay her. Since Jessica was being so cooperative, the Hunts would not forget it. Furthermore, since it was clear that Jessica would never give the formula to Mrs. Livingston, the Stewarts would now become the Livingstons' enemies. Justin's words were also a promise that he would protect the Stewarts against this powerful family. There would be difficulties with his grandmother, but Justin was making it clear that the Hunts would not stand on Livingston's side. Hearing this, Jessica heaved a sigh of relief. She chose to cooperate with Nora and Justin in the hopes that the Hunts and Smiths would decide to stand by her own family. The Stewarts and her husband's family, the Scotts, were not afraid of the Livingstons. No. The clan that they had always been afraid of, that everyone was afraid of, was the Hunts. As they climbed into the Bentley, Justin could tell that Nora was deep in thought. But he refrained from asking her what she was thinking about. Instead, he merely inquired, "Where are we going?" Nora was silent for a moment before answering, "The Andersons." Justin nodded his head in agreement, put the car into drive, and headed straight to the Andersons. When they arrived at the Andersons' home, Melissa was a little surprised when she saw them standing on the doorstep. "Nora? Come in, come in. Why are you back so soon? Did something happen?" It was difficult to tell what Nora was thinking as her expression was blank. She quietly said, "I came to see grandmother." Although Mrs. Anderson's eyes had recovered, she was still quite old. All kinds of things had happened to her body, and it seemed to get worse every year. Therefore, visits to the matriarch of the Andersons were limited. It had been a while since Nora had seen her. Melissa, who was still trying to understand what was happening, glanced at Justin, but his expression didn't reveal anything either. She simply gestured to the stairs and said, "Now's a good time. Go right on up." Nora turned and headed upstairs, while Justin sat on the sofa in the front room downstairs. This was the Andersons' house, after all. He would not go upstairs at will. There were many women at the Andersons, and he wanted to respect their privacy. This household was not like the Smiths, where he had his own room and could come and go as he pleased. As he settled on the sofa, Melissa sat opposite him in the elegantly upholstered wingback chair. She started, "Justin, there are a few things I'm not sure if I should say." Justin immediately sat up straight. He was unsure what was coming next, but he had always admired the Andersons and their honesty. Yvette was an admirable figure in the past, and the Andersons had been able to hold their own all these years. Although they could not compare to the Hunts in terms of business, they had always been in the lead of the pharmaceutical industry. And the children had married well. Melissa was a scholar and also a well-known painter. He would often visit with Simon and Melissa when they were in California for a gallery opening or a lecture. Noting the serious tone in Melissa's voice, he humbly requested, "Please, speak." Melissa lowered her eyes. "You should know Nora's temper and character well. As you can see, she's not one of those gentlewomen who are content to stay at home. She is quite ambitious and driven. I believe that she can go even further and accomplish even more than her mother did back in the day. You agree with me on this, right?" "I know. I certainly never want her to feel trapped. I've seen my friends and business associates attempt to tie their wives down, but I simply refuse to do that. It would be a waste for everyone concerned, including myself and my children. Nora will not be just an accessory. She will be my life partner." Melissa could tell that he was quite passionate in what he was proclaiming, and that he may have misinterpreted her question. She continued carefully, "Forgive me, Justin. It's just that I suppose you know that there is a rumor going around that you have an illegitimate child." "Ah," was all he could say. Now he understood. Although Nora's behavior when they had arrived appeared to be normal, at least normal for her, Melissa had obviously picked up on something, even though she had pretended not to see it. And now she was assuming that it had something to do with him. Although not many people knew that he had an illegitimate child, there were plenty of gossiping women in this city. That was the reason why Melissa had heard the rumors. For such a large city, New York could certainly feel like a small town at times. Justin hurriedly claimed, "I haven't confirmed it yet. We're waiting for the test results." "Uh-huh." Melissa stared at him suspiciously. Justin imagined what it must be like to face a mother-in-law. He felt hot under the collar and shifted on the sofa. "We haven't confirmed if the child is my biological offspring, but rest assured, I have already dealt with the woman who claimed to be his birth mother. And you must understand that Nora and I are working this out and strategizing about how to deal with him in the future." Melissa heaved a sigh of relief. "You and I both know that because of Nora's difficult upbringing, she can be a bit distant, which is not really suitable in the raising of happy children. Oh, yes, one perhaps. And then there's Pete, but he is so adaptable and self-possessed. On the other hand, a problematic child? That's an entirely different matter altogether." Melissa paused for a confirmation, but when it wasn't forthcoming, she went on, "We all know that the Hunts are extremely busy, and well, Simon and I, how shall I put this? Our child-rearing years are far behind us. I'm just not sure." She trailed off, not quite sure how to let Justin know that the Andersons and the Smiths would not be interested in raising another child, especially if no one knew the origin of the little one. Melissa had long guessed that if Justin had an illegitimate son, he was probably the result of some lavish scheme, which, of course, was not Justin's fault. In fact, it seems like Justin and Nora's twins were also the result of an elaborate conspiracy. She could understand if Justin had wanted to raise this outside child, there was nothing to stop him from doing so. But she wanted to make sure that this uncivilized 5-year-old boy would not disturb Nora and her work. She wanted some assurances from Justin that he wouldn't allow that to happen, so she waited. Meanwhile, upstairs, Nora had checked Mrs. Anderson's pulse, confirmed that she was fine and able to receive visitors. She said to her quietly, "Grandmother, I need to go and check something in my mother's room. I'll be right back." With that, she had exited the room and headed straight to the same bedroom she had stayed in after returning to New York. The bedroom that belonged to Yvette. She made a beeline to the study area and took down the dense medical book Yvette used to read. There were many notes on it, all handwritten by Yvette. She opened the folder and took out the piece of paper she had brought with her from the Stewarts. Carefully unfolding it, she laid it out on the desk and studied the writing on the paper. Yvette's writing was extremely flamboyant. She had always made the last stroke very long. Her handwriting was unique and different from others. When she turned a corner, she usually made an extra arc. After careful comparison between the piece of paper and the medical tome, Nora came to a final conclusion. The words on the paper were indeed written by her mother, Yvette. Although the words of the triplet formula were written by Yvette, that did not necessarily mean that the person who had plotted to impregnate Nora had been her own mother. However, it clearly demonstrated the idea that the lunatic somehow knew Yvette. It could be concluded that the person who had schemed against her was almost certainly Truman. This theory also explained why Ruth had a photo of her with Justin. Furthermore, if her mother had personally had schemed against her to get her pregnant, then it would have been impossible for Truman to know the entire truth. Nora frowned. All of these thoughts spinning around in her head were making her confused. It was all still such a mystery. What did it all mean? Why was her mother's formula in the hands of an impoverished old man? And the burning question on her mind was whether or not she gave birth to twins or triplets. At this moment, her questions were like a tangled ball of thread that had yet to be unwound. Nora took a deep breath and suppressed the confusion in her heart. As if running from the complexity of it all, she hurried down the stairs, where she discovered Justin was sitting on the sofa with a serious expression on his face. Melissa sat across from him, looking quite amiable. She couldn't tell if they were having a pleasant conversation or a deep one. Melissa looked up at Nora. "Well, that was quick." Nora nodded. "Grandmother was sleeping when I went in, so I had a quick look around in Mother's room and—" Her voice trailed off. When he saw Nora's gaze, Justin knew that it was time to leave. "Let's go," was all he said. He stood up and guided her to the door with his hand on the small of her back. Melissa was relieved. The man truly cared for Nora, which was a good thing. She walked to the door and waved as the two of them drove off. She climbed the stairs, and instead of finding Mrs. Anderson asleep, she stood by the window, staring at the couple driving away. When the elderly woman turned to face Melissa, she saw a worried look on her face. In an attempt to reassure her, Melissa observed, "Mom, why are you concerned? Mr. Hunt seems to be very good to Nora. I would think that you would be relieved." Mrs. Anderson sighed. "I'm just afraid that one day Nora will suddenly disappear like Yvette. I don't think that I could take that." Melissa was taken aback. Mrs. Anderson lowered her eyes. "Back then, Ian treated Yvette like this too, so well. The two of them were childhood sweethearts and had a good relationship. But Yvette disappeared just like that." I remember that Yvette and Ian had just returned home. At that time, Yvette ran into something and her face flashed with fear and she went into a daze. And that's when she went missing. Mrs. Anderson clutched her chest. I always have a bad feeling. Melissa looked at Mrs. Anderson, not knowing how to comfort her mother. After the car had gone several miles down the road, Nora told Justin of her discovery. If Truman schemed against us, what role did my mother play in this? Playfully, she added. Also, why did we have to have twins? Or was it triplets? She smiled at her joke, but when she turned to look at Justin, she could see that the expression on his face was quite serious. She asked hesitantly, What's wrong? Nora, have you ever thought that perhaps your pregnancy was not due to artificial insemination? Nora was stunned. What do you mean? Have you remembered something? Justin nodded. Recently, I've been having a dream. In it, I have returned to that night. I was with... Justin hesitated for a moment before continuing. A slightly plump woman. And we slept together. A slightly plump woman, Nora immediately said. That could not have been me. I weighed almost 200 pounds, so I was more than just a little plump. Justin cleared his throat. He nodded his head. He wanted to proceed carefully and not hurt her feelings. He coughed. That's what I meant. She was slightly plump, say around 200 pounds. She glanced at Justin. In the medical world, a person that is around my height and weighs 200 pounds would technically be considered obese. Was the person you slept with obese? He finally understood her. Nora was a scientist, and therefore she perceived everything in technical terms. She would not want him to say that she was slightly plump. In fact, she would probably get angry if he did, because it would not be a medically accurate description. Still, he didn't want to offend her, so he chose to remain silent. Nora stared at him, waiting for an answer. Seeing that she wasn't going to get one, she theorized on her own. So, if your dream is actually a memory, Nora reasoned, then whatever Truman said about the pregnancy might actually be a lie. It is possible that we might have gotten pregnant naturally. Is that what you were saying? Relieved, but still cautious, Justin simply nodded. Nora was even more confused. She felt like there were a few more knots in this mess that needed to be untied. If that is the case, was it Truman who plotted for us to be together? Or was it my mother? Previously, she had felt that her mother had planned to get her pregnant, but in her mind, she was never able to completely accept that option. But once Nora had learned that her mother had sacrificed herself in order to save Nora, her thinking had changed drastically. Perhaps, at that time, in her mother's eyes, Nora's life was more important than anything else. Nora recalled that Truman had said that she would have died if she hadn't given birth. If this was really the reason, then she could accept that her mother had arranged for her to get pregnant. But if it was planned by her mother, when did Truman take over? And how had Xander ended up in his hands? She frowned as the car had entered the Hunt Manor. She raised her eyebrows hesitantly and heard Justin say, Don't you want to see how Cherry and Xander Yale are doing? His voice was always so cheerful whenever he spoke of Cherry. And Nora had also noticed that whenever he mentioned Xander, he used his first and last name, helping to keep him distant, she supposed. Nora smiled. I really do want to know. As they got out of the Bentley, Justin gave the keys to the chauffeur, who parked the car in the garage as the two of them headed inside the house. When the two of them walked toward the living room, Nora subconsciously sped up. She was anxious to find out how the two children interacted with one another. Pete had always given in to Cherry. Cherry had also been very tolerant of Pete, because she had been looking forward to meeting her brother since she was quite little. As long as Pete did not bother her during her game, the two of them could be quite loving toward one another. But Nora knew Cherry might not be so patient with others. When Justin and Nora walked down the hallway, they heard a commotion in the living room. I'm so angry. How could you do something so stupid, Rocco? Are you fighting with a wild beast? You stayed in the jungle for so long, don't you see that the middle lane has already opened up? There's so much HP, are you blind? Although Cherry was very fierce when she scolded people in the gaming world in her childish voice, it was funny to see her dancing on the sofa. I think he might be a Buddhist who can't bear to kill. Xander stood behind Cherry's sofa and played the supporting role. Cherry rolled her eyes and turned around with her back to Xander. It was obvious that she did not want to talk to him. Oh, be quiet. Xander closed his eyes and stuck out his tongue. Mockingly, he stood there at attention. Cherry continued the next group battle. Rocco, I'm an ADC. Do you know what an ADC is? Why are you stealing from my minions? Don't you know I'm looking for more resources? When she had finished complaining, Xander joked, This guy probably died of poverty in the last time around, so he wants whatever money he can find in this life. Even though she was angry, Cherry could see his point. She nodded immediately. You may be right. Then, as soon as she finished speaking, she realized who had said those words. Cherry rolled her eyes and glanced at Xander. She tilted her head and asked in a childish voice, Can you not talk to me? Xander slapped his arms on the back of the sofa and dropped his head. But there's only you and me in this house. If I don't talk to you, who will I talk to? I don't know. The butler, I guess? I'm not talking to him. Xander continued to look at Cherry. I want to talk to you. She rolled her eyes again and stood up from the sofa. She strode upstairs with Xander following behind her. What are you going to do? Cherry claimed, I'll play upstairs in my room. Xander nodded. I think it's quieter upstairs too. It's too noisy with people coming in and out of the house. The two of them went up to the second floor one after another and arrived in front of Cherry's room. Cherry walked in and Xander was about to follow when Cherry turned around and looked off into the distance. She called out, Daddy! Xander turned around to see who she was looking at, but discovered that no one was there. He turned back to see Cherry slam her door with a bang, the door almost hitting his nose. Xander took a step back and rubbed his nose. That gesture was exactly what Justin would do as a child whenever he felt uncomfortable. He shook his head. Why was Cherry so angry? She's not as cute as she seemed on the internet. As Xander considered this, he raised a fist to knock on the door, but paused when he heard footsteps coming up the stairs. A moment later, he turned around and saw Nora and Justin coming upstairs. Xander immediately turned away and rushed into his room. The door closed. Xander ran to his bed and jumped on it. He went into fake sleep mode. With his eyes closed, he remembered what Truman had told him before he came to the States. Apparently, the woman Justin was with could be quite annoying. At the time, Xander took Truman's word for it and chose to dislike Nora. But who would have thought that Nora would be the mother of his only friend? What was he going to do now? He had originally wanted to tease Nora, but if he did that, he was afraid that his only good friend would cut ties with him. Turning on his back, Xander opened his eyes, placed his arms behind his head, and stared at the ceiling in frustration. Out in the hallway, Justin and Nora surveyed Xander's shut door. Justin observed, Why do I feel like Xander is avoiding you? Really? Nora pointed to herself. I'm not that scary, am I? She reflected on what they had just witnessed. Xander had rushed into his room and slammed his door shut with a bang. She wasn't sure what had happened previously, but agreed it was quite strange. The two children didn't appear to have quarreled, and yet they had scurried away into their separate rooms. She and Justin shared a look and came to a non-verbal agreement. They each went their separate ways. Nora went to Cherry's room, and Justin went to Xander's room. Both were planning to probe their individual wards for more details. Alone in her room, Cherry had finished her game and was video calling Pete. The little girl lay on the bed, her legs swinging. "Pete, that Xander looks identical to Daddy. He keeps trying to curry favors with me. Fortunately, I listened to you and realized his goal long ago. I ignored him." Pete replied, "Good job. Keep ignoring him. Cherry, I've asked around. Everyone says that he's the illegitimate child of Dad and another woman. He must have reason to curry favor with you, so this person can't stay. Otherwise, Mum will be very sad. It's up to us, Cherry. We have to firm our resolve." As if she was doing a spy mission, Cherry nodded. "Pete, don't worry. Although he fawns on me in every way, and his words are indeed quite nice, I won't be bewitched by his sweet talk. Daddy is allowed to have other kids apart from you and me, but only if they were born from Mummy. Any other kids will be our enemy. We can't be good to Xander or act soft-hearted toward him, or else we'll be betraying Mummy." Cherry reflected on her interactions with Xander earlier that day. After her father left that day, Cherry had sneaked upstairs with the intention of messing with this little demon. After all, she had heard on the day that she was not around, the little demon had bullied several servants in the house. He even bit the hand of her favorite bodyguard. He could be such a brat. She had to teach this lousy boy a lesson. Implementing her plan, she had secretly entered Xander's room with a spider in her hand. When she pushed the door open, she observed that the little person, who was exactly like her father, she smiled and approached him, wanting to scare him by placing the spider in his hand. The spider she held was big as a thumb, but it did not bite or poison. Cherry did not plan to hurt him, she only wanted to scare him. When the spider crawled on her arm, Xander seemed to have sensed it. He slowly opened his eyes and raised his arm. When he saw the spider, Xander was indeed frightened. He screamed, his face turning white. Cherry felt that it had been long enough. After all, she couldn't scare him to death. She was about to take the spider away when she saw that even though Xander seemed to be frightened, he grabbed the spider with his hand and stuffed it into his mouth. Cherry was shocked. She stared at him with wide eyes. Xander took 2 bites and said calmly, "It tastes good, but it's a little hard. Find a soft one next time." She was bewildered. The little princess had been making trouble and bullying others since she was young, but she was stunned by the unpredictable little demon in front of her. Cherry was dumbfounded. After a moment, she rushed towards Xander with a loud shout and reached out to poke his mouth. "Return my spider to me. She's my pet." That's right. She had raised that spider. Otherwise, she wouldn't know so much about them. But unexpectedly, Xander had eaten it. Cherry was furious. Xander smiled and looked at her. "Then should I spit it out for you?" As he said this, he planned to reach into his throat and even made a disgusting, retching gesture. Cherry hurriedly jumped back from the bed, glaring at Xander. Xander did not spit out anything. Instead, he smiled at Cherry, and she knew that she had been tricked. She cried out loud. It was not because she had been deceived, nor was she at a disadvantage. It was because her little pet was gone. She did not want to care about this stupid boy anymore. Xander could see that she was quite upset. "Hey, why are you crying?" Xander was anxious. He jumped out of bed and was about to comfort her when she suddenly opened her mouth and bit Xander on his arm. When he saw Cherry's tearless eyes, he knew that he had been tricked too. The pain in his arm made him cry out, "Hey, let go! Are you a dog?" But she did not let go at all. She was determined to take revenge for her pet spider. Xander was furious. He suddenly said, "If you don't let go, I'll crush your spider to death." Hearing this, Cherry was stunned. She looked up and saw Xander reaching out with his other hand. His chubby hand slowly opened, and her spider was lying on his palm. Cherry ignored him, turned and stormed out of his room. Xander found her quite amusing and decided to follow her downstairs. Cherry played games and scolded people in-game. Xander loved it and played along, throwing in a few words here and there. He was quite different from Pete. When it came to scolding, Pete had never been able to say mean things, which had always angered Cherry a bit. Furthermore, Cherry was beginning to feel like 2 swords were better than one. Then she caught herself. She shook her head and slapped her forehead. "Cherry, what are you thinking?" How could she have a good impression of that bad child Xander? She had to dislike him, because liking him would mean that she was betraying her mother. Cherry tried to shut off her emotions, but now, as she spoke to her brother at the end of the day, she could not help but say, "Pete, what if Xander isn't so bad after all?" Pete cried out, "Oh no!" His sister had been corrupted. Pete was silent for a moment before saying, "I'll come back tomorrow." He could not let his sister be swayed by that bad child. Cherry nodded. She was about to say something when Nora entered. She disconnected the call quickly. When she turned to face her mother, she saw Nora looking at her tentatively. Cherry immediately blinked her large, grape-like eyes and flew into her arms. "Mummy, why are you here? Did you feel that Cherry missed you?" Her little mouth was like honey. Nora rubbed her head and was about to ask her how she was getting along with Xander when her phone rang. It was Lily calling. "Boss, old Maddie is awake. He said that he has something to say to you." Old Maddie had woken up. The timing was perfect because, coincidentally, Nora wanted to ask him about the triplets. Nora hung up the phone and looked at Cherry. "Don't bully the boy." The very picture of a well-behaved girl, Cherry nodded at once. She replied, "Don't worry, Mummy. Xander and I will get along very well." For some reason, when she saw how she was behaving, Nora wasn't entirely convinced. But if Cherry was refusing to admit it, then Nora couldn't force her to, right? So she let Cherry stay obediently in the room while she went out. When she did, she happened to bump into Justin, who was coming out of Xander's room. When the two met, Nora raised her eyebrows and asked, "How did it go?" Justin looked a little awkward. "He said that he's getting along very well with Cherry and told me not to worry." She had obviously seen the two little fellows being tense around each other, so how could they possibly be having fun? And both of them were refusing to tell the truth. "Do you believe him?" Justin thought for a moment and then replied, "Whether the children are fated to like one another or not is out of our hands. There are many siblings who have difficulty getting along. You know that, so let's not force it." He was afraid that if Nora told Cherry to treat Xander better, it might instead make the children rebellious. Nora had always taken an easygoing and stress-free approach to child raising. If Cherry liked playing games, then she would let her play. Of course, this was also because of Cherry's unique character. It definitely wouldn't do for other children to become as addicted to games as Cherry was. However, Cherry's IQ was so high. She used games and played with Barbie dolls to calm down her hyperactive brain. Since Justin had put it that way, Nora nodded and turned to leave the Hunt Manor. But as she was going down the stairs, she turned and looked back. She saw a small head quickly dart back into Xander's room. Was he afraid of being seen by her? Nora withdrew her gaze, though a faint, indescribable emotion welled up in her. She quickly suppressed the feeling. She didn't want her judgment to become impaired because of emotions. Until she could be sure of whether Xander was her son or not, it was better for her to have less contact with him, in case she developed feelings for him. If that happened, things could become quite difficult. She wasn't the only one who thought that way. As Justin walked her to the parking lot, he said calmly, "Truman sent the child back so easily, and not for the purpose of saving Ruth. that means something must be wrong. Although it is highly likely from a DNA perspective that Xander is our son, until we can confirm it, we must be careful not to become too attached. Nora knew what he meant. She nodded. After leaving Justin's villa, she started to drive out of the manor. Someone waved her down while she was on her way out. With a frown, Nora stopped the car only to find the Hunt's housekeeper had stopped her. The housekeeper was looking at her with a smile. She said, "Miss Smith, Mom invites you over to her place." Nora cast her eyes down and smiled. "Sorry, but I'm not free." As soon as she said that, the housekeeper's expression instantly changed. She looked at Nora with surprise, noticing the woman's indifference. Nora started the car again in an effort to leave. Fanny, the housekeeper, had been working for Mrs. Hunt for many years. She had been taking care of the Hunt manor for several decades. She was highly respected in the manor, and even Justin treated her a little more politely than others. Fanny certainly hadn't expected Nora to be so rude to her. The 60-year-old Fanny frowned. As she opened her mouth to speak, she realized that Nora was preparing to drive off. She straightened up and took a step back, urgently crying out, "Miss Smith, please wait a minute. I'm doing this for your sake. I doubt you want to put Pete in a spot, right?" Nora lifted her foot off the gas pedal and tapped on the brake. The car came to a halt. Fanny came up to the side of the car and went on. "Miss Smith, it won't do for you to continue taking things so seriously with Mom like this. After all, she is your elder. If you give in, Mom definitely won't make things difficult for you either. Take Mr. Livingston's illness, for example. If you take the initiative to cure Thomas's condition and get the baby-making formula from the Stewarts, you will be doing them such a huge favor. And they will definitely return the favor should you ever need it. You will be the Livingstons' benefactor. Mom will definitely remember what you've done for them. Besides, this way, Pete won't have to be caught between his great-grandmother and his mother, right?" Nora knew it. Fanny must have been sent after her in an attempt to get Nora to treat Thomas's condition. She scoffed and looked at Fanny. "You want me to treat Thomas's condition?" "Sure." Seeing her relent so easily, Fanny smiled and said, "I knew Miss Smith was a smart person. I'm sure you won't want to make things difficult for Mr. Hunt either. You're making the right choice. When can you come treat Mr. Livingston's illness?" Nora replied casually, "Oh, I'm not sure about that. You'll have to make an appointment. You can contact my assistant and talk to her about it." After saying that, she stepped on the gas pedal right away. The car zoomed forward at once, puffing dust onto Fanny's face. As she drove off, Fanny realized she had been duped by the clever lady. If she had to go through Nora's assistant to get an appointment, God knows how long they would have to wait. Since everyone knew how good Athena's medical skills were, they all went to her for medical consultations. However, because the doctor only accepted 2 patients a month, there was a wait list that Lily had to deal with at the moment. Thomas wanted to have his condition treated right away. However, Mrs. Hunt had already gotten people to ask around to see if they were willing to help him skip the wait list. But they were told that they would have to wait to be seen for at least 10 years. Fanny stamped her foot angrily as Nora drove away. When she returned to the villa, Mrs. Hunt greeted Fanny with a smile. "I owe her big time, but never mind. If she performs well in the future, then I'll stop making things so difficult for her." But as soon as she said that, she saw a troubled-looking Fanny. Mrs. Hunt was stunned. She didn't agree to it. Fanny stood solemnly and said nothing. Mrs. Hunt smacked the sofa angrily, her expression instantly becoming awful. She clutched her chest, so angry that she couldn't actually breathe for a moment. Fanny hurriedly gave her a Zabe Corporation's calming pill. A short while after she took it, she finally felt like she could breathe again. She gasped out, "How dare she refuse? This is so maddening." Mrs. Hunt took a deep breath and seethed, "How dare she disrespect me again and again? It seems that I really have to teach her a lesson." Nora, completely unaware that she had infuriated Mrs. Hunt to such an extent, had already arrived at the hospital. She met Lily at the entrance door. The two women hurried down the hallway. Nora asked, "When did he recover?" Lily lowered her voice and said, "Actually, he was already showing signs of it 2 days ago. He had stopped kicking up a fuss, so it is my belief that he had already likely recovered at that time. He seemed to observe his surroundings and was full of hostility. It was only today that he finally requested to see you." Nora nodded as she entered the ward with Lily. Old Matty was seated on the bed. The burns on his face made him look extraordinarily scary. He was completely disfigured. His entire face was flat, with 2 holes in the area where his eyes were supposed to be. There were also 2 holes at his nose, and his outer lips were gone. Previously, when he was not in his right mind, he had looked a little more pleasing to the eye. But now that he had recovered his sanity and calmed down, he actually appeared scarier. If a child stumbled into the room and saw him, they would probably burst into tears out of fright. After Nora entered the room, old Maddie stared at her hard with his beady eyes. A long while later, he sighed and said, "You two really do look alike, too much alike. Anyone ever tell you that? You look exactly like Yvette." Nora didn't care about that. She immediately voiced her biggest concern at the moment. "Last time, you said that I needed to have children in order to survive, and I did. But I have to know, did I give birth to twins or triplets?" Nora had just asked old Maddie whether she had given birth to twins or triplets. She stared hard at old Maddie, searching for his reaction. She would never trust a person's words that easily, so she wanted to determine whether he was telling the truth by his reaction. What she hadn't expected was that, because of the burns on old Maddie's face, he couldn't make any facial expressions. Even his eyes were too small for her to see anything. This made him impossible to read. Old Maddie kept quiet for a while. Then he asked, "Twins? Triplets? What are you talking about? Didn't you only give birth to a daughter?" From old Maddie's point of view, the daughter of the lady he served had returned and given birth to a daughter. How could it have been twins or triplets instead? Seeing how logical his answer was, Nora frowned. "Uncle?" "I'm not worthy of having you call me that." Old Maddie interrupted her. "My name is Jake Reed. I am your mother's subordinate, and you are the young lady whom I now serve." Seeing that he had brought up her mother again, Nora asked, "Do you know what happened back then?" Old Maddie heaved a sigh. "Your mother was tricked into doing human research by a mysterious organization. When she realized what was happening, she hurriedly ran away from them. However, that mysterious organization was simply too powerful. In order to avoid implicating your father, your mother staged an elopement and made everyone think that she had betrayed your father. Then she left New York and went to a small town in California. At that time, she had only taken me with her." Old Maddie's explanation was simple, but it matched the story that Nora had previously been told. "And then?" she asked. "Your mother found someone with the last name Smith, Henry Smith. She pretended to marry him. The two of them posed as husband and wife and lived in secret in California. Do you know why she went to Henry?" Nora had a guess, but she didn't reveal it. Seeing that she wasn't going to respond, old Maddie answered his own question. "Because she wanted you to have the last name Smith. Even if you couldn't grow up under your biological father's love and care,
she still wanted you to keep your real last name.
That is exactly what Nora had thought. Her mother must have been deeply in love with Ian. That was why the tiny company she had founded in California was named Idelian Pharmaceuticals. Nora did not comment on the love between her parents, but continued to listen quietly. Old Maddie went on.
But later, she was discovered by the mysterious organization. Because I had never made an appearance in front of others, she told me to leave and hide somewhere. Then, once you turned 20, I was supposed to tell you that you must have a baby.
He continued,
I had no friends or relatives. I had been working for your mother the entire time. I didn't know what I should do during all those years either. Moreover, I knew that your mother was in danger, so I had only one thought in my mind, and that was to look for your father. The Smiths were strong and powerful. If there was someone who could save your mother, it was your father. But on my way to New York, I encountered people from the mysterious organization. They tortured me in an attempt to find your mother.
Old Maddie recalled the events from back then and shuddered. He said,
After that, my mind was in a state of confusion. All I knew was that I had to go to New York to look for your father, but I had forgotten why I had to do that. I also kept your mother's orders strictly in mind, which was to tell you that you must have a baby before you turned 20.
Nora had been stunned the moment old Maddie told her that she had to have a baby. Upon hearing him bringing it up again, Nora had so many questions, but she didn't want to interrupt him. However, judging from his demeanor, he seemed to have finished the story. There was nothing from him after that. She finally couldn't stop herself from asking, Can you tell me why I had to have a baby? Old Maddie heaved a huge sigh.
Because you would have died if you hadn't.
Nora became more confused. Truman had also told her the same thing, that she would have died if she hadn't had a baby. At that time, she had been dubious about his comment, but Truman had said that he was telling the truth. Later on, however, she discovered that what he had said was only a half-truth. Nora had always wanted to know why she had to have a baby before she turned 20. It seemed that, be it her mother or Truman, both of them had made that choice for her. But why? Determined to get to the truth, she asked again, Why? Nora hoped that the answer to her burning question would finally be revealed today. Nora narrowed her eyes and looked at old Maddie intently. It was quiet in the ward. Lily had left the room when the two started talking and was standing guard outside the door. The white-walled ward seemed completely silent. Apart from tranquility, there was only the smell of pungent disinfectant in the air. Nora lowered her eyes slightly. Then old Maddie said,
After you were born, your mother discovered that the mysterious organization was in pursuit of her. In order to ensure your survival, she died before the mysterious organization's eyes so that they wouldn't continue investigating. But we all knew that they would never stop. Besides, no one could say for sure whether the Greys were trustworthy or not.
Old Maddie looked at her.
It's only when you become strong enough that you will be able to resist becoming someone else's pawn. Your mother was driven into a corner because she was not strong enough.
Not strong enough? Nora was taken aback. Yvette could stir up the entire New York social scene and throw it into instability back then. The drugs she developed were even now quite powerful and relevant. She was a multi-talented powerhouse. To this day, she was still a legend in New York. And yet, someone like her was not strong enough.
Moreover, Nora did not feel that the mysterious organization was so powerful. In fact, they had been completely suppressed in the United States by the Special Department. Truman had almost been arrested and had to leave this country in a pathetic state in order to seek refuge abroad. So had her mother made the wrong choice back then? Would they really have been that fearsome if she had joined hands with Ian? Besides, why didn't her mother seek asylum from the authorities? These were all mysteries that she wanted solved. She wanted to ask another question, but old Maddie had already continued. In order to give you the ability to defend yourself, and in order to give you enough confidence to face the things you are facing today, she had no choice but to inject you with a serum. Nora straightened up. What? Surprise flashed across her eyes, but right after, it became a look of realization. To be honest, she had already guessed that she had been injected with a gene serum. When Lily was checking her DNA some time back, she had discovered that her IQ genes had mutated slightly. This was also the reason why the DNA comparison between her and Ian had only reached 98% and not the benchmark for a father-daughter connection. Perhaps because he saw that she had become a little agitated, old Maddie hurriedly waved her off and attempted to reassure her. It was just a little, only a little. Your father and your mother are already some of the most intelligent people in the world, so their daughter's IQ was obviously inherited. That's why your mother injected you with very little serum. Am I right in assuming that there was only a bit of difference in your DNA comparison with Ian? Nora nodded. It was medically recognized that a father-daughter pair's genes should be 99.8% similar, but hers and Ian's were only 98% similar. This indicated that a 1% change had indeed occurred. Moreover, the change had occurred in the IQ gene. Was it because she had also been injected with the gene serum that she was so smart and was able to master so many things easily? Before she could ask, old Maddie spoke again. However, that serum has a side effect. Has your health always been poor? Nora fell silent. She had been frail since she was a child and easily fell sick. She visited the hospital often and had a poor immune system. The moment the weather changed, she would inevitably catch a cold. And the hormone that her stepmother had injected her with made her extremely overweight, which carried another set of health concerns. Additionally, Caleb was also in poor health. When she thought of him, all she could remember was the sight of him coughing his lungs out. As for Truman, his physical condition was currently unknown. Given how he had kept himself hidden all this time, it was easy to assume that it wasn't that great either. But what did this have to do with her having children? Could it be that... Nora didn't want to think about it. Her head whipped up abruptly, upon which she heard old Maddie say, "Adults cannot withstand the gene serum's modification at all. Even if they succeed, they will only have 2 years left to live. And should they actually survive after those 2 years, they will lose their minds. On the other hand, children's bodies have a high level of malleability. But even so, you likely wouldn't have been able to withstand even that bit of serum. Moreover, your IQ genes were close to being perfect in the first place, so the serum couldn't have that great an effect on you. That's why, before the age of 20, you needed to expel the excess dosage by giving birth." Nora was stunned. However, her first reaction was to ask, "Then what about my children? Will there be residual serum in them?" Old Maddie shook his head. "We don't know. Your mother didn't have the time to verify that possibility either. All she wanted to do was to protect you. I had asked her about that possibility at the time, and her answer to me was..." He trailed off for a moment and then continued, "It's her child. She will have to be the one to do something about it herself.
She knew that she would have to check immediately whether there was any mutation in Cherry and Pete's genes, as well as whether there was any residual gene serum in them. She stood up suddenly. As she stared at old Maddie, she asked another question. In that case, why did the father of my children have to be Justin Hunt? Old Maddie was taken aback.
I wasn't the one who executed that part of the plan, so the responsibility wasn't with me. Back then, apart from myself, your mother also had 2 other subordinates.
Old Maddie had been out of his mind for so many years, so he definitely wouldn't know the details of Nora's pregnancy. In other words, if her mother was the one who had plotted her pregnancy, then it was likely the other 2 who had carried out the plan. She was about to ask him when old Maddie said,
One of them is Charles Ramsey, while the other is Ivan Rogers. Charles is very recognizable. He has a mole on his face, and there's a strand of hair on the mole.
Nora was shocked. Wasn't that the lunatic Jessica had mentioned? She frowned and looked at old Maddie again. How do I contact Charles? Old Maddie sighed.
The 3 of us didn't contact one another much. Besides, 20 years have already passed. Our contact methods may have become obsolete.
Nora, however, said firmly, Tell me. Old Maddie kept quiet for a moment before he said,
For more than 20 years, we never told one another our cell phone numbers. It was always one way whenever we contacted one another. No matter which one of us it was, if we wanted to contact someone, we had to publish an ad in the newspaper and state clearly the number of a payphone and the time in the ad. When the other party saw it, they would find a payphone and call you.
Nora's curiosity was triggered. Why were they contacting one another as if they were spies? And it was an old-fashioned method, even if the 3 of them were on guard with one another. What exactly was her mother doing? And why did she have 3 subordinates who behaved like undercover agents? If they didn't want the other party to know their phone number, why didn't they just encrypt it? She dug deeper. Tell me the contact method. Old Maddie nodded. After telling her about the contact method, he said,
All you have to do is publish it in the daily newspaper.
That would be a hard thing to do, Nora smirked. Most newspapers are published online these days. There aren't many physical copies left anymore. And even if there were, hardly anyone buys them. Old Maddie was dumbfounded.
What should we do?
Nora held her forehead. I have a solution, but I want these 2 questions answered. First, I'll ask again, do you know why they chose Justin Hunt as the father of my children? His question regarding Justin. All he could say was,
I don't know why he was chosen, but your mother instructed us at the time to choose the smartest one. That's because the serum she gave you was one that would improve a person's genes. Even if it was passed on to the child, their genes wouldn't be modified much, particularly if the child was born with a high level of intelligence. This quality would prevent the serum from being able to do what it was supposed to do. In a sense, it will become ineffective. That makes sense, doesn't it? It seems likely to be the reason why.
So Justin had been chosen because of his high IQ. Nora wasn't sure the answer was simple, but it was as good a reason as his IQ was slightly higher than Pete's. Was this because half of a female's genes were inherited from the father? Nora supposed that it was true. She moved forward. Then here's my last question. Nora stared hard at old Maddie. If I gave birth to more children, would the amount of serum distributed to each child have become smaller, thereby making it safer for them? Nora had based her question on this theory. Most likely,
her mother must have given her the formula that would create triplets in order to have the 3 children share a smaller amount of the gene serum. It would also mean that Xander would be her son as well. However, old Maddie smiled and answered, "Of course not. Your mother only injected you with a very low dosage of serum in the first place. The number of children you gave birth to at one time wouldn't change anything. It can be assumed that the serum would not bring much harm to the child after passing through your body." Nora was stunned. Why was this answer so different from what she had imagined? She frowned, perplexed as to how things had turned out. Old Maddie spoke up again. "Besides, your mother once said that the Andersons have genes for having twins, so it all depended on your luck. Whether you have twins or just one child, they are still your children." Nora looked closely at old Maddie for a long while. In the end, she lowered her eyes and said, "I see." She went out of the room where Lily was standing, nodding off as she leaned against the wall. Nora asked, "How long has it been since you last slept?" Through a yawn, Lily replied, 20 hours, I guess." Nora uttered an "ah," and then said, "Get some rest." Those 3 words made Lily all excited. But unexpectedly, she then heard Nora say, "Once you're rested, try to restore Xander's DNA data as soon as possible." Lily let out a huge sigh. If Nora wanted it as soon as possible, then how was Lily supposed to get a good rest? She couldn't help but complain. "Boss, you are so impractical. Instead of saying, 'Go get rest,' it would be better that you gave me a pay raise instead." "You're short of money?" "Not really." Lily blinked and replied, "It's mainly because it costs quite a lot to support young men. Besides, that man in question is your cousin. Boss, how much do the Smiths give to Quentin each month? Can we negotiate a little and have them give him a bit less in the future? If not, I won't have enough to keep him as my mistress." Smiling, Nora patted Lily on the shoulder, then she turned and left. When she returned to the Smiths, to her surprise, she found Samuel seated in the living room. Seeing her, he immediately came forward with an ingratiating smile and said, "Nora, can you talk to Joel and have him release your Grand Aunt Sue?" She looked at Joel, only to see him as smiley as ever as he said, "Granduncle Samuel, what are you saying? Nora has nothing to do with this." As he spoke, he gave her a knowing look. Nora went upstairs at once. In the corridor, she could still hear Samuel downstairs. He argued, "Joel, you can't do this. Sue did make a false police report, but it's already been so long. Shouldn't you let her out by now? I heard that you even talked to the police, so she's having a hard time inside. You can't treat her like this." Joel was still smiling at him. "Granduncle Samuel, what are you talking about? I don't understand." "You're a wolf in sheep's clothing. Stop pretending. I know all about it," Samuel yelled angrily. "Really? So, what do you know, Granduncle Samuel?" She finally knew how Joel came to be known as a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was really good at frustrating people and making them feel as if everything they did was ineffective. And in private, not only was he merciless, but also vicious. She was sure that Joel was definitely the one behind Sue's continued imprisonment. It was like back when, after Hillary was imprisoned, she had been having a very hard time. Nora had wanted to punish her at the time, but when she looked into it, she found that both Carl and Joel had talked to the people inside. This led to Hillary's life in prison becoming a living hell. This was also why, in the end, she had been duped the moment they gave her a bit of hope. Joel might look like a pushover, but in truth he was secretly quite malicious. Moreover, after Tanya poisoned Hillary and was falsely accused of murdering her, and then her name was subsequently cleared again, someone had exhumed Hillary's grave. She was already dead, yet her corpse had been taken out of the grave and whipped. One could say that this was revenge for Mia. The woman who impersonated Jill also had a miserable end. She had attempted suicide several times in prison. It was just a pity that Joel would not allow her to die after all the wicked things she had done. She had yet to be successful in killing herself, even after trying several times. Nora went upstairs and ignored the heated exchange going on downstairs. It was just that after a while, she heard that Samuel had decided to withdraw from the company's board of directors, and that he had also voluntarily given up some of his dividends to expand the ancestral graves and repair the Smiths' ancestral home. Nora shook her head, feeling like Joel was really someone who got things done quietly and inconspicuously. However, she didn't want to become involved in these affairs of the Smith family. It was all so troublesome. After going upstairs, she posted a missing person notice in the online version of a local newspaper. Because she had spent some money on it, the missing person notice was published in that night's newspaper. She was hoping that, as long as Charles was still alive, he would take the initiative to contact her when he saw the ad. After Nora was done, she leaned on the desk, her fingers tapping lightly against the desk as she waited quietly for the call. Old Maddie's recovery had allowed her to come one step closer to the truth. She had also received a great deal of information earlier in the day. The mystery of why she would have died if she hadn't had a baby finally had been solved. But when she thought of this, she hurriedly stood up and walked over to Pete, who was writing his assignments, and immediately sensed her presence. He raised his head and looked at her. "What's the matter, Mummy?" Nora held his hand and said, "Nothing much, just a routine check of your pulse." Pete looked at her quietly, his big brown eyes filled with trust and love. This made Nora suddenly think of the split-second glance she had seen from Xander when she was at the Hunt Manor earlier in the day. It seemed like there were a pair of similar innocent eyes looking at her at that time. It had only been a few hours after the ad in the newspaper was published when her cell phone abruptly rang. Nora looked over. It was an unfamiliar number. Charles's call was here. The mystery of Xander's birth would finally be revealed. Nora finished checking Pete's pulse and withdrew her hand. Pete didn't have any major problems with his health. There were some small problems typical of children his age. From the looks of it, the gene serum didn't have any effect on him. Nora was relieved. She narrowed her eyes and then answered the call. A low and deep male voice came from the other end.
Hello? Who are you?
Nora identified herself at once. "I am Nora Smith. You should know who I am." Silence came from the other end of the line. Nora slowly said, "Charles, I know you were my mother's subordinate. I have some questions for you." Perhaps because she had called him by name, Charles replied,
I have nothing to say to you.
and he hung up right away. Nora stared at her cell phone and clenched her jaw. Why wasn't Charles talking? What was he hiding? She picked up her cell phone and immediately started tracing the call to find out his location. Half an hour later, Nora paused when she saw Charles's location. She stood up, rushed out of the house, and drove straight to the hospital. Charles was in the hospital. After Nora rushed to the hospital and got out of the car, she immediately saw a group of nurses and doctors moving about in a hurry. Ambulances arrived at the entrance of the hospital one after another. A lot of people in white lab coats were anxiously giving first aid to the victims being carried out of the ambulances. Their white clothes were stained red, and some of the victims' blood had pooled on the white sheets,
forming a shocking and harrowing sight. All the non-urgent passages in the hospital had been closed, and all the doctors had rushed over to deal with the victims of the traffic accident. Nora stood at the door and looked at her busy colleagues. She heard a doctor approaching and asking, "What happened?" "A bus got into a traffic accident. All 50 or so people on the bus are injured." "How did this happen so quickly? I'll take care of the patient here if you can take care of that one over there." Although the doctors were flustered, they dealt with the victims in an orderly manner. The other patients also wisely stepped aside and waited quietly. Whenever a disaster occurred, everyone knew that life was more important than anything else. A medical instrument sounded a warning beep. Nora glanced to the side and saw that an unsupervised victim had suddenly gone into shock. Upon hearing the warning beep, a panicked nurse shouted, "Where is Dr. Wilson?" "A patient went into cardiac arrest just now. Dr. Wilson has gone over." The nurse was in a huge panic. "This patient has gone into shock. What do we do now?" Nora rushed over without thinking. She was wearing a black shirt. She took a white lab coat from the rack and put it on. Then she walked over to the nurse and said, "Let me do it." "You? Who are you?" The nurse looked up dubiously. "Are you a doctor?" Nora's one-liner made the nurse shut up. "I am Athena." Athena was definitely a respected name for people in the medical industry. Therefore, a look of joy came over the nurse's face at once. "What should we do about this patient?" Nora took a look at the patient and instructed, "Start CPR at once. I'll prepare the injection." Perhaps because Nora's voice was calm and direct, the nurse gradually calmed down. Under Nora's orders, she began to perform CPR on the patient. What came after that was a slew of first aid measures. At last, the patient's heartbeat returned to normal. Nora touched his abdomen and said, "The patient has internal bleeding. Send him for surgery at once." "Yes, doctor." Patients typically needed to go for x-rays, which required knowing part of the body required x-rays before they could even be submitted for surgery. In the process of finding the cause of their illness or the location of their injury, they ended up missing the most optimal treatment time. However, with a casual touch, Nora was able to assess the cause of the patient's condition, thereby speeding up the rescue process. This also saved them a lot of unnecessary trouble. Once the first aid had been completed, the staff outside gradually dispersed and went back to normal service. Most of the patients had also been categorized. Patients with minor or moderate injuries were currently resting in the corridor outside due to a lack of rooms and beds. As for patients with serious injuries, they had been pushed into the operating rooms. Fortunately, there were enough doctors in the hospital. Thus, after the initial panic, order had resumed. They started to provide medical treatment in a systematic and orderly manner. Nora took off her mask and gloves, and then tossed the white lab coat into the room next door. When she looked around, she noticed a man standing at the door to the operating room. He was talking to a nurse excitedly. "I'm so excited. Oh my God, I'm so lucky. Really, I'm really too lucky. This is the entire bus of people we're talking about. The bus even rolled over and everyone was injured, but not me. Look at me. I didn't even get a scratch." The nurse said, "Yes, okay, sir, we understand, but I'd still suggest that you have a full body examination done. After all, it's possible that there could be internal injuries." The man patted his chest. "No way, I am fine. There's nothing wrong with me at all. Look at me. Look at how energetic I am. I am the luckiest person on earth." As the man spoke, he began to turn on the spot. Nora had initially taken notice of the man because of his behavior, but the very moment he turned around, Nora suddenly froze, because there was a mole on the side of the man's face, with a strand of hair coming out of it. When one connected this to the reason why Nora had come to the hospital, she narrowed her eyes. Then she took a step forward and patted the man on the shoulder. The man turned around. Nora stared at his mole, and then at him. What a coincidence, Charles.
Charles was stunned. Then he said excitedly, "You know me? Young missy, how come you know me? How did you know my name is Charles?" "Do you know, I was really lucky today. The bus overturned and everyone in it was injured, but I didn't even suffer a scratch. I must have saved the world in my previous life." For the 50-year-old to say such things, Nora found it rather odd. She frowned. "Do you know who I am?" Charles didn't seem surprised at all. "It doesn't matter who you are. Isn't what matters is the fact that I dodged a bullet today. Do you know how dangerous it was? The bus's brakes had suddenly failed, and it was rushing straight toward a mountain in front of us. The woman in front of me was screaming with fear the entire time. I thought for sure I was a goner. But unexpectedly, even though the bus overturned, I turned out fine." Nora frowned upon hearing his description of what had happened. "How is it that you are okay?" Charles shrugged his shoulders and replied, "I don't know. I'm just very fortunate, I guess. It was frightening turning over in the bus like that. Quite a few people died on the spot, and others were seriously injured. Don't you see? I'm sure that you didn't even have a chance to save a few of those people who were rushed in here just now." Something changed in his demeanor, and his expression turned a little nostalgic. "I am actually not a good person, you know. Of course, I am not a bad person either. I just did some bad things back in the day and helped some bad people. Over the years, I have been devoting myself to God, and look, it has paid off. God must have been watching over me this time, and that's why I managed to escape." The more he talked, the more excited he became. He actually looked a little like he was going to cry bitterly. His chin quivered as he claimed, "After I go back, I will be even more pious. I shall donate all my money to the church." None of the other nurses were paying attention to him. Also, because he had met Nora in the midst of the chaos, and she seemingly was someone who was willing to listen, he grew quite excited. Nora stared at him in silence. No wonder Jessica had said he was a lunatic. There was indeed something wrong with his mental health. He seemed off-kilter. She lowered her eyes and slowly asked, "How much money do you have?" The man suddenly lowered his voice, but it seemed like he couldn't quite control his volume. Thus, even though he had lowered his voice, he was still quite loud. He said, "Don't be fooled by my ordinary clothes. That isn't who I am. I have tons of money. I used to work for a very important person. More than 20 years ago, she even paid me $15,000 a month." He smiled with the memory. $15,000 a month, you know? Do you know how much that amount was worth over 20 years ago? I can tell you that it was worth more than $150,000 today. I was basking in the limelight back then. Relishing his memories, he said confidentially, "After that, I earned a whole bunch of money, but I didn't dare to spend it. I would have felt guilty if I were to spend that kind of money." He burst into tears and said, "I have $5 million, but I hid the cash at home. I didn't dare to spend it, you know? But after this accident, I've sorted out my thoughts. You know how a person can have epiphanies during near-death moments? Why didn't I dare to spend that money? All that money that I was paid." Nora frowned. Even if her mother had given him $15,000 a month, that would only amount to $180,000 a year. So for him to have $5 million, he would have had to work for 30 years. Yet as far as she knew, after her mother passed away, she hadn't continued to pay these 3 people any more money. So how could Charles possibly have $5 million in cash? Also, why was he saying that he dared not spend the money? Where did all that money come from? Was the money a benefit that her mother had given these people who had worked under her for years? But if that was the case, Why hadn't old Maddie received any funds? She frowned and asked, "Who gave you the money?" Charles glanced at her and then chuckled. "I can't tell you that, young missy, I can't. I went against my conscience to earn that money, that's all I can tell you." So he went against his conscience to get paid a large amount of cash. Nora narrowed her eyes. At this moment, the family members of the victims were beginning to arrive at the hospital. Some rushed over to the operating rooms to search for family members, while others rushed over to the bodies of their loved ones and began to cry bitterly. The hospital was slipping into chaos once again. When Nora was about to ask Charles about something, a voice came over. "Charles, are you okay?" She turned to see a 50-year-old man approaching the two of them. He was standing in front of Charles and looking him up and down. "You don't have any family, so they called me instead." Charles replied, "What can happen to me? I'm fine. I'm totally fine. Let me tell you, I was really very lucky today, my man." Charles then started to recount in detail again what had happened. Charles was seriously neurotic. She rolled her eyes but remained quiet while Charles relayed his miraculous experience. Just when she was about to ask him something, Charles's friend suddenly said, Okay, I get it. I know you went through life and death today. You were so lucky. But why are you suddenly so chatty?" This comment caught Nora's attention. She studied the two men. Charles was still neurotically babbling on and on. "Because I'm agitated and excited. I thought I could only be a dock worker for the rest of my life. Did you know that? I thought I didn't deserve happiness anymore. I thought I could only be like you for the rest of my life. Only be a worker bee." His friend's expression changed. "What do you mean by that? Who are you looking down on?" Still babbling, Charles had worked himself up and even started crying, as if the emotions that he had kept suppressed for a long time were finally erupting. He said, "Teamsters, of course. Not only is the work tiring, but the pay is low. You guys may be uncultured, but do you know who I am? I graduated from Hamlin School of Medicine, you know." The Hamlin School of Medicine? Nora was intrigued. His colleague, however, had never heard of the school. "Why are you rambling on? Did you hit your head? I'm trying to figure out why you're acting so weird today. Never mind being chatty, but you're talking about a medical school. If you were a high-achieving student, why would you have been working all these years as a labourer with us?" Charles waved dismissively and said, "Yeah, I'm different from you. So you see, God still cares for me. Even when I was in a traffic accident, I didn't get hurt at all." Nora's heart suddenly sank as she listened to their conversation. She took a big step forward to ask his friend, "Excuse me, is he usually very quiet?" Charles's colleague nodded. "Yeah, Ramsay talks very little. It's rare for him to be this excited. I think he might have hit his head." As soon as he said that, Nora grabbed Charles's hand to feel his pulse. She quickly shouted to the staff around them, "Arrange a CT scan for him immediately." A doctor was stunned and looked over. "What?" He studied Charles carefully. "But he doesn't seem injured." Charles shook his head. "Yeah, I am not injured. I am not doing a CT scan. Are you a doctor or do you just want my money?" As soon as he said that, Nora looked at Charles seriously with an awful look on her face. She said, "You graduated from medical school, right? Then let me ask you this. What are the symptoms of intracerebral hemorrhage?" Charles subconsciously answered, "Excessive secretion of adrenaline causing people to become overly excited. After that, they will bleed from their 7 orifices." At this point, he stopped speaking, and he actually understood what he was saying. Nora's expression became even more serious. Yes, that's right. If there was too great a change in Charles's personality, then he most likely was suffering a hemorrhage in his brain. Internal bleeding was a very serious condition. There was a high chance that it would block blood vessels and form congestions.
By the time it was discovered, it would be too late for diagnosis and treatment. Nora hadn't immediately discovered Charles's abnormal behavior because she'd thought that he was mentally unstable. After all, according to Jessica's description, Charles was a madman. But through the chat with his colleague, Nora understood that he was not usually like this. It was only with his colleague's description of him as a reserved man that she realized Charles was not himself. In addition, the description certainly fit the personality of the man who had called her only an hour before. That was how she had concluded that Charles's behavior was abnormal for him. The doctor next to them, however, frowned.
Who are you? Why should I arrange a brain CT for him? Don't you know that people who undergo CT scans are exposed to radiation? It's best that healthy people not undergo that exposure unless it is completely necessary.
After he said that, Nora immediately said, "I am Athena." Stunned, the doctor shut up at once and looked at Charles. Then he immediately picked up his cell phone and called the CT department upstairs to make arrangements for the man to move to the head of the line. Nora looked at Charles again. He was dumbfounded. He touched his head. At this point, he could faintly feel something warm trickling out of his nose. He touched it and found that it was blood. Only then did he realize that something was wrong. His eyes widened at once.
I get it now. It's them. They are here to silence me.
Nora clutched his wrist tightly. "Tell me, who is trying to silence you? The mysterious organization?" Upon hearing the words mysterious organization, at last Charles focused and looked at Nora. In his state of excitement just now, after grabbing Nora, he had immediately started chatting with her. He hadn't noticed Nora's face at all. But in this very instant, he saw her face clearly. She looked exactly like her mother all those years ago. His eyes widened as he quietly inquired, "Miss Yvette?" Nora's eyes flickered faintly with a sharp glint. "I am Nora Smith." Her name made Charles's pupils shrink. He subconsciously said,
"You look so much like Miss Yvette now that you've lost weight."
After she lost weight? Nora understood that this comment meant that Charles had definitely seen her a few years ago. Was it when she was pregnant? Or had her mother gotten him to set up her pregnancy? The thoughts came flooding into her mind. However, Nora found that Charles's pupils were starting to dilate. There was no time for her to ask all the questions she wanted to ask. She could only ask one of them. "Tell me, did I have twins or triplets back then?" Charles's eyes began to gloss over. He was losing focus and he could no longer think straight. He stared at Nora blankly.
"Twins or triplets?"
His eyes suddenly reddened and he said,
"Miss Nora, I've let you down. I betrayed you back then and also betrayed Miss Yvette. I have felt guilty about this for many years."
But that was not what Nora wanted to hear. She asked him again, "Please tell me, was I pregnant with twins or triplets?" Charles's eyes were red as he seemed to drift off.
"Yeah, the mysterious organization threatened me and bribed me. They gave me $5 million. But because I betrayed Miss Yvette, I have never spent that money all these years. I'm sorry I plotted against you. I am going to repay your kindness now. They wanted to silence me, but they didn't expect that I would meet you before my death." And what he said next made Nora's eyes widen in disbelief, but also with enlightenment. Charles clutched her sleeves tightly. The world was already spinning in his vision. Nevertheless, he tried his best to calm himself and to tell her something important. More than 20 years ago, Yvette had told him, old Maddie, and the other man to go into hiding and to make Nora give birth to a baby before she turned 20. Because this was the only way she could stay alive. The three of them had fled in 3 different directions. Old Maddie had attracted and taken more of the mysterious organization's attacks for the two of them.
Because of that, and because he hadn't received any news from him since, Charles suspected that he might already be dead. Old Maddie's name wasn't actually Old Maddie. He was known as that because his way of doing things was outrageous. Yvette also trusted him the most, perhaps because he was the one who would sacrifice his own life for Yvette's sake. After Old Maddie attracted more firepower from the mysterious organization, Charles had left with the other person. He'd thought himself successful, but he didn't expect that the mysterious organization could still catch him. But now he knew it was truly impossible to get away from them. At that time, Charles had become scared. He knew very well how fearsome the mysterious organization was. They had threatened him with hurting his family. Frightened and wanting to protect his loved ones, he gave in and told them about Yvette's plans. And because he had done that, the mysterious organization rewarded him with $5 million. And for that money, they only had one request. And that was to tamper with Nora's pregnancy so that she would give birth to as many children as possible. After he did all that, the mysterious organization knew that he was no longer of any use to them, so he had to go into hiding because they began to hunt him down. While he was in hiding, he met Jessica Stewart. In order to repay her for saving his life, he gave her the miraculous medicine that could help a woman give birth to triplets. He knew very well what the mysterious organization had in mind. So how could he possibly allow Nora to fall for their tricks? With that thought in mind, Charles grinned. He looked at Nora and said confidently, "You gave birth to twins, not triplets." As soon as he said that, his vision darkened and he fainted. In the last few moments before he passed out, he thought to himself, "Ms. Nora can only and must only give birth to twins. The existence of an extra child would be a catastrophe for her." Besides, the triplets were clearly a trap that the mysterious organization had set for her. How could he possibly allow the mysterious organization to succeed? After he told her that, as though he had completed his life's mission, he closed his eyes. He whispered what he thought would be the last few words he would ever utter in this lifetime. "Ms. Nora, you don't have to save me." His life would probably come to an abrupt end at this moment, right? Back then, for the sake of his family, he had betrayed Yvette. But later on, his family contracted an illness and died anyway. Their illness was incurable, but he knew that Yvette's medical skills had been the culmination of the industry at the time. Had she still been around, perhaps she could have saved his family. That was his fate, he supposed. And now he could finally repay his debt to Yvette with his life. Twins, not triplets. Nora stood there dumbfounded and in disbelief. After doing a DNA test and discovering that Xander's genes were 80% similar to hers, she could basically confirm Xander's identity, because complete strangers would never have such a high degree of similarity in their DNA. That was why she had told Justin that there was a 90% chance that he was their son. To be honest, at that time, she had more or less become convinced that she had given birth to triplets. Yet Charles was telling her that she didn't have triplets. How could that be? It was funny, though. At the same time, she also felt a sudden sense of closure. In reality, triplets were just a conjecture that she and Justin had made. This news was also the best possible result for Xander. She hadn't been sure how either of them would have handled having someone else's child in their house. And even though it had been confirmed, she was still feeling quite sad. Nora lowered her gaze and stared fixedly at the man in front of her. For some reason, she found herself dissatisfied with his answer. She stepped back as doctors rushed up to Charles, and she saw as he started to bleed from his nose, eyes, ears, and mouth. Whenever a patient was suffering from internal bleeding, and these specific symptoms broke out in a short period of time, they were always quite difficult to save. with his medical background, Charles also knew this himself. Nora suddenly stepped forward and followed the stretcher into the operating room. All along the way, she stared hard at Charles. She couldn't let him die. She wanted the truth. She didn't believe his answer. The next day, when an exhausted Nora walked out of the operating room, she instantly spotted old Maddie, who was waiting outside the operating room, staring at the door. The moment the door opened, old Maddie stood up. The man in the hospital gown asked nervously,
"Miss Nora, I just heard that Charles was in a bus accident. How is he?"
Nora rubbed her temples and yawned sleepily. She glanced at old Maddie and replied, "He'll be fine." Old Maddie breathed a sigh of relief. But at the same time, he looked at her nervously and asked,
"Then, have you asked him whether you gave birth to twins or triplets?"
"Yes, I have."
"Then you gave birth to how many?"
Seeing the anxiety in old Maddie's eyes, Nora kept quiet for a moment before she finally replied lazily, "He said I gave birth to twins." Old Maddie heaved a huge sigh of relief.
"That's great."
However, she noticed that his reaction was a little inappropriate. Nora wanted to ask about it, but old Maddie avoided looking at her and quickly changed the subject.
"Miss Nora, to be honest, you shouldn't have saved Charles. I only just found out that he betrayed Miss Yvette back then. What's the point of saving a man like him?"
After saying that angrily, without waiting for Nora to ask any further questions, he turned around and walked back to his ward. He said,
"I'm too old. I've only just recovered. I'm going back to rest."
Nora stared at him as he walked away. She could tell that both old Maddie and Charles were hiding something from her, and it had something to do with whether she had given birth to twins or triplets. For some reason, it seemed like old Maddie was hoping that she didn't give birth to triplets. Why would that be? She frowned as Lily walked out of the operating room. While Nora was operating on Charles, Lily had been her assistant throughout the entire operation. Lily knew all about Nora's family affairs, so she asked, "Boss, should I still continue the DNA restoration?" Nora was silent for a long while. After thinking for a while, in the end, she made her decision. "Yes, continue it." She knew that Charles, and also old Maddie, both seemed to truly care for her and want to protect her. Thus, they hadn't told her some important, crucial things. But she was no longer the young girl who needed their protection. She was grown up now, and she felt strong and powerful enough. She should be able to deal with everything herself. With that in mind, she followed old Maddie leisurely into his ward. He could only look back at her helplessly.
"Miss Nora,"
he said. Nora sat on a chair and rubbed her forehead, somewhat sleepy and extremely impatient due to not getting any rest. She slowly said, "I want the truth. Why do the two of you insist that I only had twins?" Old Maddie sighed and replied,
"Miss Nora, it's not that we're insisting on it, but rather you gave birth to twins. Isn't that what Charles told you? I mean, I can't say for sure because I was not with you at the time."
She knew that old Maddie was unaware of the situation with the children, but that didn't stop Nora from changing the topic. "What exactly are you hiding from me?" Her words made old Maddie choke on his breath. He started to muse again, which was fine with Nora because she was not in a hurry. She could sense that old Maddie didn't harbor any hostility towards her, and that he was quite very loyal to her mother. She slowly said, "Please, tell me the truth." Old Maddie's jaw tensed up.
"Miss Yvette left you a voice recording before she died, didn't she?"
"She did."
"Well, you must have listened to it over and over again, right?"
Nora nodded. He went on,
Miss Yvette said that until you become strong enough, there are some things that I can't tell you."
When Nora heard this, she looked him straight in the eyes with her own cat-like eyes gleaming. Full of self-confidence, she announced, "I am already strong enough." Old Maddie sighed.
"Miss Nora, there are so many strong and powerful people around us, and I know your medical skills are the best in the world. In fact, one could even say that you are already on par with Miss Yvette. But even so, she still wasn't the mysterious organization's match. She became too obsessed with medicine. That was her only focus. She didn't branch out. A truly powerful person needs to be impressive in all aspects. For example, martial arts. I won't compare you with your predecessors. I heard that the most powerful martial artists of today are the big brother of the Irvin School of Martial Arts and the big sister of the Quinn School of Martial Arts. Can you beat them in a fight? Another example would be the most popular and trendy skill of today, computer science. After I woke up, I found that society had undergone drastic changes over the last 2 decades. Computers were not as common back then, but there are hackers everywhere now. I heard that the most awesome hackers now are Q and XYZ. How do you think you would compare to their computer technical skills?"
Seeing that Nora's expression had frozen, Old Maddie thought that his words were having a huge impact. So he painstakingly continued his attempt to persuade her.
"Let's not talk about such technical knowledge anymore, but just about fleeing. I recently learned that the most impressive international racer is Yancey. If you are in danger, can you drive as fast? Yancey can escape from the danger, but can you?"
Old Maddie went on,
"They are all experts in a single type of technical skill. There's also one more absolute thing. In this world exists the most powerful organization, the Imperial League. Have you ever heard of it? There are only a dozen or so people in the organization, and every single one of them is a big figure who can cause chaos with a flip of their hand. The global economic crisis in the 1970s was caused by this group. It's only when you are a member of the Imperial League that you will truly have the power to be able to confront the mysterious organization. But, Ms. Nora, can you do that?"
Nora thought to herself, if he hadn't gone into so much detail, she would never have realized that she had so many secret identities. Old Maddie kept talking.
"There will always be someone better. Miss Yvette was too arrogant, which led to her failure in the end. If you can achieve all the things I just listed, then I'll know you are strong enough. In that case, I will tell you the truth. But are you strong enough?"